In the heart of the unforgiving Atlantic, where the salt spray stings like a forgotten promise and the horizon offers no sanctuary, two worlds are about to collide. This is not a tale of polite drawing rooms or whispered gossip over tea. It is a story of a woman sold into a gilded cage and the sea captain who finds the fire beneath her ice. From the opulent ballrooms of Regency London to the blood-stained decks of HMS Defiant, prepare yourself for a journey of betrayal, survival, and a love that burns brighter than the stars they use to navigate the dark. If this tale of forbidden longing and high seas adventure captures your heart, please subscribe and leave a comment below telling me which period drama world you'd most like to escape to. Your engagement helps these stories find their way across the vast digital ocean to other kindred spirits. Chapter 1. The Lavender and the Salt. HMS Defiant did not sail, it laboured. It was a beast of scarred teak and salt-crusted iron, groaning as it cut a jagged scar across the face of the deep blue. For Countess Sophia Sterling, the ship was merely a floating extension of the prison she had inhabited for the last 3 years. She stood at the stern, her gloved hands gripping the railing until the wood bit into her palms. In her cabin, tucked away in a trunk lined with silk, were the lavender sachets her maid had packed, the scent of English gardens, of safety, of a life curated by men who looked at her and saw only a title and a dowry. But here, on the quarterdeck, the air was thick with the scent of oakum, tar, and the raw, predatory smell of the sea. It was a scent that didn't care for her lineage. "You'll find the spray has little respect for French silk, my lady." The voice was like the sea itself, deep, turbulent, and carrying a distinct chill. Sophia did not turn. She knew the man to whom the voice belonged. Captain Alistair Thorne was a man who seemed carved from the very mast of his ship. His skin was bronzed to the colour of polished mahogany by suns she had never seen, and his eyes, when he deigned to look at her, were the shifting, dangerous grey of a brewing storm. To Thorne, she was a delicate inconvenience. He had made his disdain clear from the moment she stepped onto his deck in her travelling suit of pale primrose. To him, she was a porcelain doll being shipped to India to rejoin a husband who, by Thorne's estimation, probably valued her less than a sturdy crate of spices. "Silk can be washed, Captain," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the way the ship pitched beneath her. "But I find that the stifling air of a drawing-room stays in one's lungs forever. I prefer the spray." Thorne moved closer, his boots thudding rhythmically on the deck. He stood beside her, a towering presence of wool and authority. "Lord Sterling's letters were quite specific about your comfort. He noted that you are of a fragile constitution. He expects you delivered to Calcutta without a blemish." Sophia finally turned to him. Her hood had fallen back, and stray golden curls escaped from their pins, whipped frantically around her face. "My husband treats me like a line item in his ledger, Captain. He measures my fragility by the cost of my doctors, not the strength of my spirit. You need not worry about the blemishes. The sea cannot do more damage than London already has." Thorne paused. He had expected a complaint about the damp or the quality of the salt beef. He hadn't expected the flash of steel in her eyes. For a moment, the professional mask of the sea captain flickered, revealing a flicker of reluctant curiosity. The days turned into a blur of rhythmic motion. The Defiant pushed further south, the air growing heavy and sweet as they neared the equator. Sophia found herself unable to remain in the cramped confines of the great cabin. The walls felt as though they were closing in, echoing with the ghost of her husband's cold, transactional voice. Instead, she sought the deck at midnight. It was during these ghost hours that she found him. Thorne was often at the binnacle or leaning over the great charts in the navigation room, the amber glow of a single lantern casting long, flickering shadows across his rugged features. "You should be sleeping, Countess," he said one night, not looking up from his compass. "The stars are different here," she whispered, stepping into the small circle of light. "In England, they look like pinpricks in a shroud. Here, they look like a map to somewhere else entirely." Thorne looked up then. The lantern light caught the hard line of his jaw and the softened expression in his eyes. Without a word, he beckoned her closer. He stepped back slightly, allowing her space at the table, where a vast hand-drawn map of the Indian Ocean lay spread. "This is the Laccadives," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He pointed a calloused finger to a cluster of dots. "And here, the Andaman Sea. It's a world of monsters and beauty, Sophia, not a place for earls and countesses." "Perhaps that is why I like it," she murmured. She reached out to trace the line of their journey, and for a fleeting second her fingers brushed against the back of his hand. The contact was electric, a sharp, sudden heat that had nothing to do with the tropical air. Sophia didn't pull away immediately. She felt the rough texture of his skin, the heat of a man who lived a life of action, so different from the soft, powdered hands of the men she had known.
Thorne's breath hitched. The scent of her lavender sachets clinging to her hair collided with the raw, masculine scent of the ship. It was a clash of two worlds that should never have met. "You are a dangerous woman, my lady," Thorne said, his voice strained as he finally pulled his hand away. "Not because of your title, but because you look at the horizon as if you intend to conquer it." "I don't want to conquer it, Captain," Sophia said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I only want to see what is on the other side of the cage." A week later, the storm they had both sensed in the air finally broke. It was a tempest of biblical proportions, turning the sky black and the sea into a mountain range of churning foam. The crew scrambled, the screams of the boatswain lost in the roar of the wind. Thorne was at the helm, his muscles straining as he fought the wheel. He looked toward the quarterdeck, expecting to see his noble passenger being hurried below by her terrified maid. Instead, he saw Sophia. She was standing at the prow, her silk veil long since torn away by the gale. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her form, and her hair was a wild halo of gold. As a massive wave crashed over the bow, sending a spray of icy diamonds into the air, she didn't scream. She laughed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated defiance. In that moment, through the sheets of rain and the howling wind, Thorne didn't see a countess. He saw a woman who was finally, for the first time in her life, breathing. And as his eyes met hers across the pitching deck, he knew with a soul-crushing certainty that he was lost, not to the sea, but to her.
The lavender was gone. There was only the salt, the wind, and the terrifying realization that they were no longer strangers on a ship, but two heartbeats thrumming to the same wild rhythm of the storm. The peace following the storm was a fragile glass thing, shattered at dawn by the panicked cry from the crow's nest. "Sail ho! Black flags on the horizon!" HMS Defiant, crippled by the tempest, with her mainmast splintered and her speed halved, was a limping bird in a sea of sharks. The vessel pursuing them was the Vulture, a ship of nightmare and legend, its hull painted the colour of dried blood and its sails dark as a bruised sky. Captain Thorne didn't waste breath on comfort. He barked orders that sent the crew into a frenzied dance of survival, but amidst the hauling of ropes and the clearing of the decks, his eyes found Sophia. She stood by the hatchway, her face pale but her jaw set with that same iron defiance he had seen during the gale. "Go below, Sophia," he commanded, his voice stripped of all courtly pretense. "Stay in the hold. If they board us, lock the door and do not open it for anyone but me." "I am not a parcel to be stowed away, Alistair," she countered, using his name for the first time. The sound of it seemed to vibrate in the air between them, more intimate than a touch. "I grew up on my father's estate in Ireland, tending to tenant farmers when the physician was miles away. I know how to stitch a wound and set a bone. You have men who will be broken today. Don't let them die because you're too proud to let a countess get blood on her skirts." He gripped her shoulders, his hands heavy and grounding. For a second, the world of pirates and cannons vanished. It will be a slaughterhouse down there.
"Then I shall be the one to clean it," she whispered.
The first broadside from the Vulture shook the world. The sound was a physical blow, a roar of thunder that ripped through wood and flesh alike. The surgeon's cockpit on the orlop deck quickly became a vision of Dante's Inferno. Lanterns swung wildly, casting grotesque, elongated shadows against the dim, humid air. Sophia stripped off her fine silk bodice, standing in her camise with her sleeves rolled past her elbows. She didn't flinch when the first man was carried in, his leg a ruin of splintered bone and shredded wool. She didn't faint at the metallic, cloying scent of blood that soon coated the floorboards, making them slick and treacherous. She moved with a silent, lethal efficiency, tearing her own petticoats into bandages and barking orders at the terrified cabin boys. Above, the ship groaned under the weight of the boarding parties. The sound of steel clashing against steel and the rhythmic thump-thump of falling bodies echoed through the timber. Then came the silence, a heavy, suffocating pause in the violence. The hatch flung open, and 2 sailors stumbled down, carrying a weight that made Sophia's heart seize in her chest. It was Thorne. His navy coat was sodden, not with seawater, but with the dark, pulsing crimson of a deep cutlass strike across his ribs. He was conscious, his teeth gritted in a snarl of agony, his eyes searching the gloom until they locked onto hers. "Out," Sophia commanded the sailors, her voice a whip-crack. She knelt beside him on the blood-slicked deck. The wound was jagged, weeping life with every shallow breath he took. "You stayed," he wheezed, a ghost of a smirk playing on his blood-flecked lips. "Stubborn woman." "Be quiet and save your strength for hating me," she snapped, though her hands trembled as she reached for the cauterizing iron heating in the small brazier. The air in the cockpit was thick with smoke. She knew what had to be done. If the bleeding didn't stop, he wouldn't last the hour. She looked at the iron, glowing a vengeful orange, and then at the man who had looked at her and seen a human being instead of a trophy. "Hold him," she told the boy at his head. "Do it, Sophia," Thorne growled, his hand reaching out to catch hers for one brief, bone-crushing squeeze. "I'd rather burn at your hand than die by theirs." The hiss of the iron against his flesh was a sound she would hear in her dreams for years to come. The smell of scorched skin filled the cramped space. Thorne's body arched, his scream muffled against his own shoulder, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Sophia didn't look away. She couldn't. She held the iron steady, her tears carving tracks through the grime on her face, until the wound was sealed. When she finally pulled back, Thorne slumped against the deck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The battle above seemed to be fading, the pirates finally repelled by a desperate, furious counterattack from a crew fighting for their wounded captain. But here in the dark, the victory felt different. Sophia collapsed beside him, her ruined camise stained with his blood, her forehead resting against his. In the chaos of smoke and iron, the titles of Countess and Captain had burned away. They were stripped bare to the bone, just 2 souls, battered and broken, clinging to one another as the only solid thing in a world turned to ash. "You saved me," he whispered into the crook of her neck, his voice a raw thread of sound. "I saved myself," she replied, her voice breaking, "because I cannot go back to the dark, Alistair. Not after you showed me the stars." The emerald canopy of the Andaman Islands was a beautiful, indifferent witness to their ruin. HMS Defiant was no more than a skeleton of blackened ribs jutting out from the turquoise shallows of the cove, her back broken upon the reef. On the shore, the hierarchy of the British Empire had washed away with the tide. Sophia sat on a bleached piece of driftwood, her feet bare and buried in the warm white sand. Her once exquisite gown was a memory. She wore a tattered shift and a pair of Thorne's discarded breeches hacked off at the knee. Her skin, once kept porcelain under parasols, was now kissed by a golden, honeyed bronze. She held a sharpened bamboo spear, her eyes fixed on the crystalline water. With a sudden, fluid motion, a grace born of necessity rather than a finishing school, she struck. A silver flash emerged, wriggling on the tip of the wood. A duchess would have fainted, a voice rasped from the shade of the palms. Sophia turned, a triumphant, crooked grin lighting up her face. A duchess would be starving, Alistair,
And I was never a duchess, only a countess, which, as it turns out, is a very useless thing when one is hungry. Alistair Thorne leaned against a tree, his chest still bandaged with the remnants of her silk scarves. He looked thinner, his face more angular, his movements careful to favour his healing side, but his eyes were bright with a terrifying intensity. He watched her not as a captain watches a passenger, but as a man watches the sunrise, with a mixture of awe and the knowledge that it might burn him. In this Eden of the damned, the world of London felt like a fever dream. Here there were no ledgers, no arranged marriages, no cold husbands waiting in Calcutta. There was only the rhythm of the tides and the heat of the fire they built each night.
"You're learning too well," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave as she walked toward him, the sea dripping from her limbs. "If we are ever rescued, you'll find the drawing rooms of Mayfair quite claustrophobic." Sophia's smile faded. She dropped the fish and stood before him, the distance between them vanishingly small. "If we are rescued, Alistair, I go back to being a ghost. Here, for the first time in 24 years, I am solid. I am real." He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of salt from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, a stark contrast to the man who commanded 100 sailors. "You were always real. They just didn't have the eyes to see you." The afternoon sky turned a violent shade of violet as the monsoon, sudden and vengeful, broke over the island. The rain was a solid wall of water, dousing their small fire in seconds. Thorne grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the narrow mouth of a sea cave tucked into the limestone cliffs. Inside, the world was reduced to the size of a few square yards. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the heavy floral perfume of the crushed hibiscus flowers Sophia had tucked into her hair. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded beast, but inside, the silence was louder. They sat huddled together for warmth, their shoulders touching. The tatters of their clothes offered little protection against the chill that followed the rain. Sophia could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart against her arm. It was a heartbeat she had fought to keep. "Tell me," Thorne whispered, his gaze fixed on the grey curtain of rain at the cave's mouth. "If you could sail anywhere, not where you are sent, but where you choose, where would it be?"
Sophia leaned her head back against the cool stone. "I used to think I wanted to go to the edge of the map, to find a place where the rules of men didn't reach. But I realize now I don't want a place. I want a purpose. I want to be more than a signature on a marriage contract." She turned her face to him, her eyes searching his. "And you, Captain, you have the whole world. What is left for you to find?" Thorne turned to her then, and the look in his eyes made her breath hitch. The storm outside was nothing compared to the upheaval in his expression. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her salt-matted curls. "I have spent my life charting the world, Sophia," he said, his voice a low, jagged confession that tore through the air. "I have mapped the stars, the currents, and the coastlines of 5 continents. I thought I knew every destination worth reaching, only to find my true destination in a woman I can never have." The admission hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Thorne leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her lips. "In London I am a commoner, and you are up here. In India you belong to a lord. But here, God help me, Sophia, here I can only see you." The yearning that had been building since the first midnight watch on the Defiant finally snapped. Sophia didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her hands finding the hard muscles of his back, drawing him closer until there was no space left for titles, for husbands, or for the world that waited to reclaim them. For a moment, as the monsoon raged, they weren't survivors of a wreck. They were the masters of their own tiny temporary kingdom, where the only law was the gravity pulling them together.
The rescue came not with a flourish of trumpets, but with the hollow, haunting sound of a British scouting vessel's whistle cutting through the morning mist. For Sophia, the sight of the Union Jack fluttering against the tropical sky felt less like a salvation and more like a shroud. As they were rowed toward HMS Valiant, the distance between her and Alistair grew with every stroke of the oars, the invisible walls of class and propriety rising from the depths of the ocean to solidify once more. By the time they reached the bustling port of Calcutta, the transition was complete. Sophia was draped in borrowed heavy silks that felt like lead against her sun-kissed skin. Alistair was relegated to the officers' quarters, once again the subordinate to the crown. But the India Sophia found was not the one she had been promised. "The Countess is a miracle," the governor's aide whispered, his face pale as he escorted her toward the grand estate of Lord Sterling. "The Lord, he has been quite vocal in his grief. The entire city is currently gathered for his memorial ball, to celebrate your life, my lady." Sophia's blood ran cold. The estate was a sprawling monument to colonial excess, lit by 10,000 lanterns. As she stepped into the grand ballroom, the music, a tittering, delicate waltz, faltered. She looked like a ghost come to life, her face bronze and fierce, her eyes hard as diamonds. At the far end of the room stood Lord Sterling, looking remarkably hearty for a grieving widower. He was not dressed in black, he was in vibrant scarlet, his hand resting possessively on the waist of a blushing heiress half his age. The memorial ball was a betrothal party. Before the scandal could erupt, a hand gripped Sophia's elbow. It wasn't the soft touch of an aide, but the calloused, steadying presence of Alistair Thorne. He had bypassed the guards, his uniform rumpled, his expression a mask of cold fury. In his other hand, he clutched a packet of water-stained letters. "Do not speak," he hissed in her ear, pulling her into the shadows of a banyan tree on the veranda. "Look at this." He thrust a letter into her hands. It was written on Lord Sterling's heavy, embossed stationery, addressed to a captain known only as the Vulture. "The vessel will be at the coordinates provided by the 14th. Ensure the wreck is absolute. No survivors are to reach the coast. My wife's dowry is settled in my name upon proof of her death. Your commission will be paid in gold through the usual channels." The world tilted. The pirate attack hadn't been a misfortune of the sea. It had been a cold-blooded assassination. Her husband hadn't just moved on. He had tried to drown her in the dark so he could marry a fortune without the messiness of a divorce from a woman who had failed to provide him an heir. "He bought the ship that was meant to be my coffin," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a burgeoning volcanic rage. "He underestimated the sea," Thorne said, his voice a low growl of protective steel. "And he underestimated you. This letter was found among the papers in the pirate captain's cabin. It was destined for a dead man." Sophia looked from the letter to the man standing beside her. Alistair's eyes were full of a silent, desperate question. He was offering her the truth, the weapon she needed to destroy the man who had discarded her. But he was also offering her a choice.
"He thinks I am a childless ghost," Sophia said, her fingers tightening on the evidence of her attempted murder. "He thinks he can bury me in the salt and dance on my grave." "You could have him hanged for this, Sophia," Alistair said, his hand lingering near hers, not daring to touch. "You could take his lands, his name, his pride." "No," Sophia said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her lips, a smile she had learned from the storms. "I don't want his name. I want to watch him realize that I am the only thing he could never conquer." She turned back toward the ballroom, the light of the lanterns catching the fire in her eyes. The twist of fate had stripped away her last shred of loyalty to the world that had caged her. She wasn't just a survivor anymore.
She was a woman with a secret that could burn a lordship to the ground, and a captain who was ready to catch her if she fell. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and artificial laughter, a landscape of porcelain masks that Sophia no longer recognized as her own. She stood at the threshold, the borrowed gown of midnight blue clinging to her frame like a second skin. Beside her, Alistair Thorne remained in the shadows of the arched doorway, his presence a silent promise of thunder. "Are you ready?" he whispered, his voice the only honest thing in a room built on lies. "I have been drowning for 3 years, Alistair," she replied, her gaze fixed on the man at the centre of the room. "It is time I came up for air." She did not enter the room with the measured, demure steps of a countess.
She walked with the predatory grace of the sea. The music died in a discordant scramble of violins as she cut through the crowd. Guests gasped, clutching their fans. The young heiress beside Sterling turned pale as milk. Lord Sterling froze, his wineglass hovering halfway to his lips. His face transitioned from a mask of jovial wealth to a sickly ashen grey. "Sophia," he stammered, his voice cracking. We thought. The ship was lost. It was a tragedy of the greatest. A tragedy commissioned in your own hand, Arthur." Sophia's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a clarity that silenced the entire hall. She reached the silver dinner tray held by a nearby footman, and with a flick of her wrist, dropped the blood-stained, water-damaged commission onto the metal. It landed with a sharp, ringing clatter. "The captain of the Vulture is dead," she said, stepping into Sterling's personal space until he was forced to retreat against a banquet table. "But his record survived. This is your signature, is it not? A contract for my murder, a price tag on my life, so you could trade up for a newer, wealthier model." The room erupted in a frantic, hushed whispering. Sterling reached for the letter, his hands shaking, but Sophia slammed her palm down on it. "Don't," she hissed. "I didn't come here to reclaim a seat at your table. I didn't come here to be your miracle. I came here to tell you that the Countess Sophia Sterling died in the Atlantic. She died when her husband tried to sink her." She leaned in, her eyes burning with a fire that made the lord of the manor recoil. "Keep your lands, keep your title, keep your debts and your hollow life. I am declaring myself dead to you and dead to this society. If you ever speak my name or attempt to follow me, this letter goes to the Admiralty. You will not find a new wife, Arthur. You will find a noose." She turned her back on him, the ultimate insult, and walked toward the open veranda. She didn't look back at the shocked faces or the man who had tried to kill her. She walked straight into the night air, where Alistair was waiting. At the gates of the estate, a carriage was not waiting. Instead, Thorne led her toward the docks, where the silhouette of a new vessel, sleek, fast, and built for the horizon, danced on the black water. "A new beginning," Alistair said, handing her a rolled parchment as they stood on the pier. "The Nomad. I secured her with every last guinea of my prize money and a sizable loan. She's mine, or rather, she's ours if you'll have her. No title, Sophia, no cages, just the wind and the work." Sophia looked at the ship, then at the man who had seen her soul through the spray of a gale. She took his hand, her fingers locking with his, taliced, stalums, and real. "I have spent my life as a bird in a gilded cage," she whispered, stepping onto the gangplank. "It's time I learned how to fly." They did not return to the stiff morality of London or the suffocating expectations of the East India Company. As the years bled into legend, stories began to circulate in the ports of the world, tales of a captain and a woman with eyes like the storm who sailed a ship that no one could catch. They were ghosts to the world that had tried to break them, but to each other they were everything. Standing on the deck of the Nomad, as the sun dipped below the edge of the world, Alistair pulled Sophia against his chest. The scent of lavender was long gone, replaced by the honest, sharp tang of the salt, and the warmth of a love born not from fairy tales, but from fire and truth.
They were finally free, two hearts beating as one, charting a course toward a horizon that promised nothing but the beautiful, infinite unknown. I hope this journey across the seas stirred your soul.